Anyways, I thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. My very first efforts, by the way, in digital media began in 1979 here in Paris. I was building my first digital news product at that time, and it was using technology called broadcast teletext. And that technology that we were using came from French companies. You might recall the word Antiope or the French Videotech system, Minitel system. Those were the technologies that we worked with. It brings to mind, by the way, one of my favorite stories of technology innovation. As part of that effort, as part of that collaboration, we had engineers from France working with us at our television studios in Los Angeles. And we'd regularly get shipments of experimental televisions from Thomson CSF. One Saturday, I was in my office. There was no one there. It was just me, and was surprised to see a few minutes later one of the French engineers, an endearing fellow by the name of René Desassis, whose wife, by the way, was an extraordinary cook. He said, and so I asked him, I said, like, why are you here? And he said, well, I'm here because I wanted to get a head start on unpacking this new gear that we just got from Thomson. Upon which he opened the back of one of these sets and tumbled out several kilos of French cheese and butter, which his wife had insisted that he find some way of getting into the States, because you couldn't get it through customs. So yes, that marked the first ever digital transmission of fresh dairy products. I don't believe it's been done since. Anyways, getting a bit more serious. When I'm in Europe these days, I'm typically trying to provide, one, clarity about Google's role in the ecosystem, engaging in discussions about how we can strengthen our mutually beneficial relationships with publishers, and along the way, frankly, building long-term friendships, which is great. I often explain that while the objective of a publisher is to build great go-to sites, sites that people want to come to, it is our job at Google, for the most part with Google News and Google Search, to build great go-away sites. The only metric, for instance, my team at Google News cares about is how many publisher articles get clicked on. That's how we measure our effectiveness. If the user isn't clicking on articles, then we're not surfacing the right ones. We're very proud of the fact that Google overall sends some 10 billion visits to news sites each month. And while Google News itself makes no money, those 10 billion visits from Google represent real revenue to the publishers who create those articles. And that's a very good thing. We know at Google that the value of our services, specifically search, is directly related to having a rich and sustainable knowledge ecosystem. We also know that we can all better attain that objective through close collaboration, which is why we're here today, in sharing of ideas, in providing enabling platforms, in helping improve information architectures. And there's a lot more that we can and will do going forward. Let's talk about the new media ecosystem, because that media ecosystem born of the internet is by far the most open communications environment in the history of civilization. No comparison. Our cultures now have the potential, in a sense, to support freedom of the press as never before. As an American, the open internet is, in a sense, our First Amendment brought to life. It's the democratic ideal. Anyone and everyone can publicly express themselves to the entire world, or the world that matters to them. Such open public expression can happen because there are no gatekeepers, except where governments take restrictive action. Unfortunately, such restrictions happen far more often than any of us would like, whether that's blocking YouTube in Turkey or arresting bloggers in Egypt. Sadly, but assuredly, politicians around the world will continue to suffer threats to the open internet. And governments will often use fear as a motivating force to convince their populations that such restrictions are both necessary and proper. I learned that lesson of the fragility of free expression from my father-in-law's experience fighting the politics of fear during the Red Scare period of the 1950s. He was a Hollywood screenwriter. His name was Dalton Trumbo. He wrote many great films, Roman Holiday, Exodus, Spartacus, many others. In the 1940s, he was the highest paid screenwriter in Hollywood. But in October of 1947, he was called before a committee of the United States Congress and asked a single question: are you now, or have you ever been, a member of the Communist Party? He refused to answer that question on First Amendment principles. The government had no right to ask him his beliefs. He was cited for contempt of Congress, found guilty, spent a year in prison, and blacklisted. For the next dozen years, he was relegated to writing scripts under assumed names for very small amounts of money. 2 of those films, by the way, won Academy Awards under assumed names. For me, it's a lifelong reminder of how a government's constitutional principles regarding free and open expression can crumble, even in an apparently advanced democracy. By the way, it was Dalton Trumbo who penned the phrase, "I am Spartacus," that has evolved into a template for memes. Je suis Charlie. Restrictions on expression and innovation can also come through the efforts of corporate interests to control their historical markets. The history of modern communications is littered with such efforts. In the United States, for an example, the introduction of FM radio was 20 years behind the rest of the world, not for lack of technology, not for lack of capital, but due to the determined efforts of David Sarnoff and RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, to hold back FM in an effort to protect their vast interests in AM radio. The open internet will challenge us. It will generate a cacophony of voices and a fragmentation of audiences. It will challenge our understanding of the economics of information. It will challenge our incumbent institutions who will want to go back in time to a golden age they remember, which may or may not have been so golden. It will challenge our politics. It will likely challenge our understanding of who we are. Will we be able to resist the urge to control it, to lash back, to make it no longer open? That's the story that will play out over the coming years and decades. Why are we here? At the highest level, I assume we're here because we care deeply about the evolution of media, care deeply about the evolution of journalism. I also believe we're here because despite the challenges of such dramatic change presents, we're excited by the opportunities for innovation because we realize we are experiencing a renaissance in media creativity and are energized by the kind of creative breakthroughs we're seeing, and in fact, see here today. Allow me to share a few observations about the ecosystem and how one might approach it. When it comes to the new digital era, I believe it's easy to miss just how dramatically the internet media ecosystem is compared to the old. The internet is most typically seen as a shift in how media products are delivered. What we used to deliver via ink on paper is now delivered via pixels on screens. In fact, I think as many of us now know, the internet changes every dimension of the media model. First, more news and information is being consumed by more people than ever before. There are now nearly 1.75 billion smartphone users, and that number is expected to exceed 2 billion by 2016. Fun fact number 1, more cell phones were sold in the world last year than toothbrushes. Maybe not a fun fact after all. Today, media dominates our daily lives. We twitch with stolen glances at the screens in our palms, as I see in the room, or as wearable devices evolve attached to our faces, our wrists, our clothes. Fun fact number 2, according to Motorola, the typical smartphone user checks their device 150 times a day. Some of us, many, many times more. We learned via studies from Pew and other research efforts that more news is being consumed than ever before. It is consumed throughout the day and from a far broader array of sources. And of crucial importance, it is consumed through various modes of discovery. Social networks and search engines have effectively taken the place of newsstands, news boxes, and the promotional circulations that we put on airline seats. These are the low-cost marketing funnels, as it were, that have allowed new digital brands to go quickly to tens of millions and in some cases hundreds of millions of users in a very short period of time. Media, in fact, is no longer just a part of our lives. It has become the very fabric of our lives. We now maintain many of our relationships entirely in the virtual world. I, for instance, have more relationships in the virtual world than in the analog world, and I'm sure I'm not unique. We don't just consume media, we in effect live within the media. The internet changed our basic relationship with media. We're not just consumers, we're producers. Indeed, we all have the ability to be journalists and publishers, and millions have seized that opportunity, whether they or we think of them as journalists or not. And today's news consumers are no longer the passive audience respectfully absorbing what the high priests of mainstream media want to tell them. They direct their own media experiences. They pick the voices they want to listen to, some mainstream, some not. They contribute, they share, they comment, they push back. Given these dramatic changes, the very definition of a media product and its attendant business model require fresh thinking as well. Too often, I sense the internet is seen as an extension of past markets rather than a new market in and unto itself, a new marketplace that requires a rethinking of any existing product. One can find lessons in other media environments as they evolved. Each environment, whether it was a new media form like radio or television, or new ecosystems like cable or satellite delivery, spawned unique product configurations and unique brands. Let's look, for instance, at further historical context regarding newspapers in the United States, where in fact the modern American newspaper was the direct result of earlier technological disruption. In the United States, newspapers historically were not particularly profitable. Most large cities had 4, 5, 6 or more from varying viewpoints, areas of focus, and quality. New York had dozens. It was a tough business. In each market, the largest circulation paper did well, a few others did okay, the remainder struggled. But something significant happened in the late 1940s. Television was introduced. Television ad revenues grew very rapidly. Within 3 years, they took 15 to 20% of the total ad spend in the United States. Indeed, within 3 years of television's introduction, newspapers went from owning 37% of the advertising market to 25% and further downward from there. As a result, not surprisingly, we saw a steady decline in the number of newspapers from 5 down to 1, in some cases 2, with combined sales operations that the Justice Department said was okay to happen. We went from having a rich set of voices to having only a few. However, for the newspapers left standing, it marked the introduction of a 40-year period of extraordinary profitability. The survivors went from fighting for every ad dollar to having near monopolistic control over local ad pricing. They had tremendous distribution leverage and appropriately used it to fullest advantage. Now the story gets to the true lesson of this bit of media history. And the lesson is this, that the design of a media product and its attendant business model is as tightly tied to the structure of the underlying marketplace it's in as a specific flower or plant is rooted to a specific climate or habitat. You can't take a redwood tree and put it in marshy wetlands and expect it to survive. Ironically, the disruption of television triggered the golden era of near-monopoly newspapers in the United States. It resulted in a dramatic expansion of the newspaper product from a thin one to a thick one. Opportunities to sell advertising stimulated many new editorial approaches in many new editorial sections. We had lifestyle sections and gardening sections and automotive sections and food sections, fashion sections. All of these soft news sections were created because the ad sales department basically said, we can sell a whole lot of advertising to home improvement centers if you'll give us a home section that can build an audience for us. But alas, that unique position could not last forever. The onset of cable television in the United States with its vast array of targeted channels was the first to chip away at this highly profitable product. Then in the 1990s, of course, the internet happened, and the landscape began its inexorable change. With that open distribution came many new voices, from Craigslist to Monster.com, from Salon.com to HuffPo, from 1 million blogs to 1 billion social posts. From a standpoint of democratic free principles, would anyone really want to turn back the clock on that one? I don't think so. The openness of the internet and the attendant shifts in the information and advertising economies changed the definition of a successful media product. While newspaper and magazine product models are highly effective in a print media ecosystem, those product models do not directly translate to an open digital media ecosystem. all things to all people newspaper portals of 4 decades ago have become far less relevant as the web has matured and spawned thousands of media products focused on nearly as many niche audiences. To me, this suggests the following. Does one transform an existing brand into this new ecosystem, or does one analyze the new information marketplace, find new opportunities, and create or acquire the appropriate product and brand for that opportunity? Whether it be large opportunities in, say, sports coverage, targeted offerings in areas ranging from politics to public policy to parenting, or highly commercial opportunities in employment listings. Might it be wiser, in a sense, to consider breaking the umbrella brand conceptually into its component parts, each with its own carefully tuned approach to the product experience and the business model? The question has no single right answer, but it's a question that deserves to be asked. Many traditional media companies, including the New York Times, are now beginning to recognize this by launching sites and apps that are focused on target markets. Last year, for instance, the New York Times took the rich evergreen assets they had in food preparation, some 17,000 recipes that had been buried under the New York Times brand, and launched it as a standalone site. And I was absolutely fascinated with the Shipstead presentation because that's clearly the approach that's going on there. Where can we find niche opportunities with targeted solutions? I would also suggest that another large opportunity for new products will come from the potential of data journalism. Most of you have already incorporated data journalism into your reporting efforts, analyzing massive data sets, exploring public sources of data, and so on. Such efforts will have, and indeed must have, a major role in the future of journalism. Even more so if we embrace a shift in thinking about journalistic form and function. Can media organizations leverage data journalism to not only help with stories, with crafting that 3,000-word story, but to build persistent, in a sense, automated information services that live on and on, to build what I think of as knowledge utilities? The potential is huge. Here's one example, and an intentionally esoteric one. 3 years ago, ProPublica in the United States launched a deep investigation of the practices and performance of dialysis treatment centers. There are several thousand in the United States. As part of that investigation, they, of course, did the 3-part, 3,000-word article. But they also launched and continue to maintain the dialysis tracker, a potential life-saving tool that allows patients to locate dialysis treatment centers near where they live and assess their medical performance, their morbidity rates, their costs. Such approaches to creating knowledge utilities can provide immense value to audiences and often for comparatively modest ongoing cost. In many cases, knowledge utilities can have their own successful business models. And in fact, ProPublica has developed a very significant line of revenue off of their data journalism efforts. In a sense, it was that kind of thinking that caused the New York Times to see the opportunity in cooking. It represented a product shift from here today, gone tomorrow editorial approach to the knowledge utility approach, providing ongoing value from expensively produced content that otherwise would have been dropped into the archive or what newsrooms, at least in the United States, refer to as the morgue, which is where content goes to die. Yes, today's digital media ecosystem is massive and varied and chaotic. Whether we like it or not, fact-based journalism competes with everything from raucous opinion to corporate advocacy on a near equal footing. That very fact suggests both the opportunity and the responsibility to rethink the very architecture of the news article such that excellent fact-based reporting can rise above that maelstrom of public expression. The media ecosystem of 1975 was comparatively meager and easily understood. There were clean buckets of brands, newspapers and magazines that were introduced to us by our families, our classmates, our friends, our colleagues. In the United States in 1975, the total number of newspaper, magazine, TV, and radio brands was numbered in the low tens of thousands. Obviously, we have an ecosystem now where it's in the tens of millions. As rich as it might have felt back then, it obviously pales in comparison to today's vast media ecosystem. an ecosystem where there are far fewer cues to help us form a sense of the credibility of a given source, of a given voice. Motivations vary. Conflicts of interest are often unclear. It's an ecosystem that challenges the underpinnings of the old trust model of trust us because we're us, trust us because we're the New York Times, trust us because we're FAZ, trust us because we're Le Monde. Over the last few months, a collective industry effort has begun to form called the Trust Project, an effort led by Sally Lehrman of the Markkula Center for Ethics, and one which I helped get started as well. It includes news organizations from across Europe, the United States, and beyond, from Al Jazeera to Zeit. The effort pursues the following questions, both big and small, and I would ask us to consider them as well. How might we help our readers divine fact from fiction, distinguish between wisdom from spin? Or are we simply giving into the chaos and hoping that somehow our voice, our brand, will magically rise above it? Can we provide better signals, more points of information to help a reader make more informed decisions, to help search engines, for that matter, better understand and rank results, to help the myriad algorithmic systems and recommendation systems that are increasingly molding our media lives? Signals which often, I find, are sitting in a publisher's internal workflow systems today, not harvesting their true value within the ecosystem that they're in. Might we divulge, for example, within a consistent framework, the impressive expertise that resides in quality news organizations, that helps the reader decide why this person might know what he or she knows, that allows the reader to understand the full body of the reporter's work, their sense of expertise over the subjects they cover. Last fall, I sat down with a talented young reporter by the name of Adam Ellick, an extraordinary multimedia journalist at the New York Times. He did the original documentary on the 12-year-old Pakistani girl Malala Yousafzai. And her getting shot in the face 7 months later is something that still burdens him with a sense of guilt. He told me he had recently finished a 3-month reporting effort about ISIS. And his piece had just completed several weeks of extensive internal vetting with editors and lawyers. He was pleased that it would finally be published the next day, but he also noted with no small amount of melancholy that his work would likely be rewritten and republished by many others. When a reporter like Adam talks to me about the deep vetting that his or her piece went through before the publish button was pushed, I ask, why doesn't the reader know that? In an ecosystem where we consume content based on the social recommendations of our friends, why don't we know of the professional peer endorsements that back that reporter's work? In a news ecosystem where any enterprising story is followed by an explosive cloud of derivative work, might we learn the backstory that this reporter, Adam Ellick, was on the ground in Pakistan, not desk-bound and constrained to the range of the mousepad? Might we embrace the practices of academia and even Wikipedia and make better use of structured citations to show the underpinnings of a reporter's fact-based efforts? We don't suggest such architectural rethinking is a panacea. There's no demand that such approaches be applied to every or any piece of expression. But we do believe that news organizations can and should be loud and proud about why they, the New York Times or La Stampa or ProPublica or Le Figaro, deserve to rise above the maelstrom and get the attention and respect they deserve. Can trust drive revenue? Can programmatic ad systems benefit from having a deeper sense of the regard in which a particular brand is held? If you talk to Dave Goering at The Guardian, he'll point to comforting evidence that premium advertisers share the same quest, finding signals in the ad exchanges to align their efforts with premium media brands. But most importantly, I believe it's crucial that journalists and publishers proactively consider how content architectures might be tuned to the needs of the new ecosystem in this ever-expanding maelstrom of free expression. I've been working in the digital trenches for 35 years. That being said, I often note that the biggest difference between me and anyone else in the room is that I've made more mistakes than you have, and that is absolutely the case. What I've learned is the importance of stepping back and questioning all assumptions to reassess what one currently thinks of as ground truth. I've learned that innovation in new markets requires experimentation that will often generate failure. And I've learned through direct experience that the primary challenge, and often the most difficult challenge, as we discussed today, is changing the culture of an organization to both encourage reassessment and creative risk-taking and to accept the inevitable failures that happen along the way. It's important to note that the world has never experienced such dramatic and pervasive change, so it shouldn't be surprising to us that corporate cultures may not be optimized to address such rapid change. In fact, corporate cultures have been designed for the opposite. They've been designed to optimize for consistency and efficiency and risk aversion, not for rapid, often massive cycles of change, right? Innovation is hard. I don't mean to suggest it's easy. But innovation is not just about a sexy new user interface. It's about what products are crafted for which markets. It's about rethinking not just what is produced, but how it's produced. It's about considering how one builds an organization with the appropriate resources and the appropriate mindsets such that constant innovation is imbued into the organization's DNA and into the role of each and every participant. And it means, again, establishing that sense that mistakes will be made. That's a good thing. That's where true learning happens. And in fact, I think it requires that we think differently about it in our organizations. What I was going to note earlier is one thing that's unique about digital is, yes, the cost of innovation is less, but also we have much greater capabilities to experiment. If you're going to create a new feature, you don't need to roll it out to all 100 million of the users of The Guardian, for instance. It's important to create experimental frameworks that allow one to create new features and test them with small percentage of the audiences. It lowers the risks and also changes the psychological dynamic from my saying, I've got a great idea and I better not be wrong because I'm putting it in front of 100 million users, versus my saying, I think I've got a good idea. Let's try it out and let's learn from it. Very different approach, subtly different. We know at Google that past success does not guarantee future success. We've learned as well that shifts in the underlying landscape, for example, the rapid shift to mobile or the rapid growth of social, can happen way faster than we expect. We increasingly realize at Google that the culture itself must continue to evolve, that the only perfect culture is one that can recognize its inevitable imperfections and seek to address them. Yes, we live in challenging times, but there's never been so much experimentation and innovation in journalism. We see that here today. We see that in the success of Edwy Plenel and Mediapart. We see it in the Pulitzer Prize-winning efforts of ProPublica, the Center for Public Integrity. And I'm very proud to say my former Salon colleague, Glenn Greenwald, for his work on the Snowden story at The Guardian, which he now continues at The Intercept. I also have no doubt that long-standing media companies will continue to find great opportunity and success in the digital realm. They've got great core assets to work with, and we're already seeing great progress. But again, innovation is key. Experimentation is key. I do see this era as an absolute renaissance of creativity in media and journalism. All the experience of the last 20 years points in that direction. It will not come without challenges. It will not evolve without ongoing innovation, but it is happening. Yes, we live in interesting times, likely far more interesting than any of us had ever expected. I'm certain that the future of journalism will indeed be richer than its past. In fact, I believe it already is. But it will also be quite different than its past. Many of us, may all of us for that matter, find the excitement and the passion and the creativity to address these challenges and harvest these opportunities and share that excitement with others. I thank you very much for your time.